Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we will discuss bias against Israel and anti-Semitism in the media. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Dembler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, Thin Edge of the Wedge. I grew up in a Midwestern town, Elgin, Illinois, where the Holocaust was not discussed because all our parents and grandparents had come the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and pogroms in Eastern Europe. Yet, in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army officer husband and myself found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany. It changed our lives forever.
Akiva van Koningsveld lives in Israel and is editor at Honest Reporting, an organization that monitors the media's coverage of Israel and exposes and responds to inaccuracies and bias about Israel or Jews. When he still lived in the Netherlands, he was policy officer at the Center for Information and Documentation Israel, the Netherlands' leading organization in combating anti-Semitism and spreading awareness of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Akiva was awarded in 2019 by Jerusalem Post in recognition of his online activism against the Israel boycott movement and anti-Semitism on social media, and for presenting Israel as a vibrant democracy and its contribution to the world. Akiva, welcome to our show, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So I get to ask the first question, which is, please tell us a little about your background and what brought you to the work that you do.
So my name is Akiva van Koningsveld. I'm 26 years old. I was born in the Netherlands in a small city called Utrecht. I grew up there, and eventually I studied there. I went to law school. Eventually, at around the age of 18, I started working at the Center for Information and Documentation Israel in The Hague, where I moved. And really, ever since, I've been involved in the fight against anti-Semitism and pro-Israel advocacy. 2 years ago, I met my wife, who is from the US, and together we immigrated to Israel 2 years ago. And soon after making Aliyah, I found a job at Honest Reporting. And Honest Reporting's mission is really to ensure truth, integrity, and fairness when it comes to the media, especially as it relates to Israel. And I've been working there ever since over the past 2 years.
So it's mainly your work at the Center for Information and Documentation Israel in the Netherlands that brought you to what you do currently, which is at Honest Reporting, correct?
Yes, when I was a student around the age of 18, I got involved in the Jewish student movement in the Netherlands, and I became the president of the Center for Information and Documentation Israel's youth movement. I did that for a few years. And after that, I went on to become a policy officer there and so forth.
So what drove your involvement with pro-Israel advocacy and anti-Semitism?
Well, it's several things. I saw as a student how unfairly Israel was treated by a large student population. When I was 18, I went to Israel for the first time in my life, which was a life-changing experience. I saw the country for myself, and I experienced how really daily life in Israel is so much different than it's being portrayed in the media. And that drove me to get active in the student movement and the fight against anti-Semitism.
Yeah, great. So can you briefly give us some examples of anti-Semitic media reporting?
Well, there's several blatant examples that come to mind when you ask that question. One of the first examples I think of is in 2019, when the New York Times published a cartoon of then President Donald Trump being led by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu as a canine caricature, implying obviously that the Jewish state controls the politics of the U.S., which is a blatant anti-Semitic dog whistle. That is one of the examples that comes to mind. Looking more at the European context, what I think of is in the Netherlands in 2018, the publicly funded broadcaster published an article about, quote, the Jew George Soros, end quote, controlling U.S. politics. They later pulled that article and acknowledged that it was anti-Semitic. So these are a few examples of blatant anti-Semitism in the media. At the same time, something that we've been seeing at Honest Reporting is that it is not apparent from the reporting that it's anti-Semitic, but the people involved in producing the news reports are themselves anti-Semitic. I think we'll speak about that a little bit later. But we have found examples of countless op-ed writers, stringers, other personnel that works for mainstream publications that on their personal Facebook and Twitter accounts shared the most horrific anti-Semitism. And obviously that seeps into the media coverage of Israel.
So how does Honest Reporting monitor the news for bias and inaccuracy in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Well, we have a research and editorial team based in Jerusalem. We have offices in New York and in Jerusalem. And our editorial team, every day of the week, we monitor the media. We read basically every single piece about Israel that's being produced in the world media.
Wait, what languages do you monitor?
We have mostly English language media. But we also have Spanish speakers on staff. Myself, Dutch is my second language, so I also monitor the Dutch media, and we have a wide variety of staff who monitors the worldwide media, and also our readers. We have an email list of around 100,000 people. They send us daily alerts telling us whenever they spot bias in the media.
Okay, keep going. Thank you, but that's what I wanted to know.
So,
Yeah.
Honest Reporting got its breakthrough during the second Intifada in 2000, the Palestinian uprising in 2000, when the New York Times, Associated Press, and other major media outlets published a certain photo. Please, can you tell us that remarkable story?
Yes, in September 2000, which was during the second Intifada, the terror wave that was the second Intifada, major media outlets, like you said, including the New York Times and the Associated Press, they published a picture of a young man covered in blood, who was standing next to an Israeli policeman, and the caption identified him as a Palestinian victim of riots, with the clear implication that the Israeli soldier was the one who hit him. Turns out the boy, Tuvia Grossman, was actually a Jewish student from Chicago, and he was assaulted by Palestinians and not by the Israeli police officer. And that really set off Honest Reporting's mission to combat media bias against Israel. Honest Reporting started as a small email list, alerting people about media bias and encouraging them to contact media to issue corrections wherever bias or inaccuracies show up. And like I said, nowadays we have a list of around 100,000 people who read our content on a daily basis. yeah, that's how it all started.
So there is this picture of I looked it up on the internet, the photo, in 2000, of this young man with blood in his face, blood all over his body, and this Israeli policeman standing behind him. And we have quality media like the New York Times, like Associated Press, making this huge mistake of thinking that this was injury of a Palestinian by an Israeli soldier, which also, fuels the blood libel, or it rests a little bit
Correct,
on
yeah.
the blood libel. But how do you explain that, Akiva, that quality media like the New York Times, maybe the most renowned newspaper in the world,
the newspaper of record, yes.
Yeah, that it makes that kind of a mistake, and that all the others do the same thing? We had similar examples recently, which I may have time to ask you about, but how come? How does it work?
Well,
how does it go?
Well, yeah. Well, we got to realize that this is not a new phenomenon. This is a lot of the anti-Semitism in the media and anti-Israel bias actually has parallels with Soviet anti-Semitism and sometimes even Nazi era anti-Semitism, painting the Jew or the Jewish state in this case as the ultimate evil. And that is a parallel you clearly see still in the media today. So it's nothing new. That's important to note. And like I said, there's a lot of good people in the media, and a lot of journalists who, the majority of the journalists who work every single day to inform people correctly. But at the same time, there are also people who are actively working against Israel and are using this platform of mainstream media outlets to promote their anti-Israel talking points.
So do you think that that false caption under that photo, was that it came there by mistake, or was it deliberate?
I am no prophet, or I cannot look at our mind reader. I cannot for sure know how these things happen. But what I do know is that journalists do not like to be called out when they make a mistake, and that is exactly what Honest Reporting does every single day. We call out journalists when they make mistakes or when they show bias. And a journalist for a major newspaper told us not too long ago that journalists are not they're not really scared of being called out for being anti-Israel or being anti-Semitic, because they can just say it's a slur or it's a baseless accusation. However, they are afraid of being called bad journalists. And that is a very important distinction, and that's what Honest Reporting does. We confront them with the facts, and a lot of times when there are reasonable people working in the media, they are open to this criticism, and they will issue a correction. A lot of times they won't, but
I would just like to say something. That picture was actually the grandson of a man who was my father's boyhood friend. And I think that to give journalists, because I used to be a journalist, but not a fair thing, that in the melee that happened, I think they could get confused, but it should have been checked. So
yes, definitely.
Yeah. So that's,
yeah, and after this all happened, years later, Honest Reporting organized a meeting between the police officer in question and Tuvia Grossman, who was in the picture.
right.
There's actually a video on our website how Tuvia Grossman lives in Israel now.
I'm not surprised.
And
yet.
it's really beautiful. Yeah.
So I just thought the connection, as soon as you said Chicago, I said, oh, I know this account.
Can you tell us about the incident in August of 2022? when Honest Reporting exposed 3 New York Times freelancers who had a violent and anti-Semitic social media history. How did you identify and make known the information about these 3 freelancers, and what happened when you exposed them?
Yeah, so this all happened only a few weeks ago, in the wake of Operation Breaking Dawn against Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. So what happened is that the Hamas issued certain guidelines for foreign media entering Gaza. One of the new rules that they issued, it was later retracted, but initially issued, stated that foreign journalists going into the Gaza Strip should always be watched, basically, by a local, we call them stringers, a local Palestinian journalist, and these guidelines also stated that the local journalists would be held accountable for whatever the foreign media outlet writes. Obviously, very problematic. This will obviously create biased coverage if journalists are not given freedom to report whatever they want, and they are afraid that if they write something that would paint Hamas or Islamic Jihad in a negative light, for example, about the fact that more Islamic Jihad rockets killed civilians in Gaza than Israeli strikes, that these local journalists would be held accountable. And I think we all know what Hamas and other terrorist groups do with traitors or collaborators in Gaza.
They kill
it's
them,
not pretty,
right?
and it's not pretty. Yes. So this is the context where this happened. So after Hamas issued these guidelines, I wrote an article. I looked into who are these local Palestinian journalists that work for the major media outlets that everyone knows, like the New York Times. The New York Times was the example that I looked at. Initially, we found one local stringer, Fadi Hanona, who worked with the New York Times on virtually all of their pieces about Operation Breaking Dawn. And when I looked into his Facebook page, I found out he praised Adolf Hitler for one, and he praised Palestinian terror attacks. Yeah, obviously someone like that will not report truthfully to the journalists of the New York Times whatever's happening in Gaza. I think that is clear to everyone that there's a personal bias here. So we wrote an article about that, and the New York Times 2 days later immediately fired him, and they told us that they were very sorry and it shouldn't have happened. He didn't work for them before, and they hired him apparently as this conflict was starting. They quickly hired someone local on the ground, and they fired him after that. That was obviously the only right thing they could have done, and they are to be commended for that. However, after the New York Times stated that they've only worked with this journalist for the last couple of weeks, we wondered, is he the only one? Is this a one-time mistake by the New York Times? Because obviously, it took me around 5 minutes to go on his Facebook page and find these pro-Hitler posts. So obviously there was a major mistake made here when it comes to their due diligence. The New York Times should have caught that. So after they told us it was a one-time mistake, we looked into other freelancers that work with the New York Times, and I found two, Soliman Hiji and Hossam Salem, a videographer and a photographer that both work. Soliman Hiji worked for the New York Times up until 2-3 years ago, as far as we could find. And Hossam Salem, a photographer, worked for the New York Times during the recent conflict. And we found again that Soliman Hiji praised Adolf Hitler and Hossam Salem's Facebook was every other post praised Palestinian terrorism and the killing of Jews and suicide attacks, and the most horrible posts. And he encouraged Palestinians to shoot Israelis. After this happened, we again contacted the New York Times, and they told us that, quote, appropriate action has been taken, end quote, which obviously meant they were fired. And this really took off because it obviously showed a major problem in the media, that there's no proper due diligence done. So it was covered in a lot of major media outlets, including Fox News, the Daily Wire, the New York Post. So that went viral. Yeah.
How come that a media outlet like the New York Times doesn't do due diligence of its contributors?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a major problem, and it took me with all three of them, it took me only a few minutes to find these posts. There were some of them were even in English or Arabic, but a simple search, even with Google Translate in Arabic, should have sufficed to find this, and then they should never have been hired. It's hard to say where this is coming from, obviously. And we have to note that it wasn't just the New York Times working with these people. There were a lot of the BBC worked with some of these journalists, Vice News, also Australian media too. So it's not just a problem. It's not just a problem of the New York Times. It's a problem more broadly. And yeah, that's really the reason why we wrote this article, because the media need to be aware that when they hire people who are anti-Semitic, they will be held accountable.
Where did you publish it?
Our website, www.honestreporting.com.
Okay.
But other media then, because I saw the article somewhere, picked it up from your website.
Yeah,
So that it got wider distribution.
definitely. Yeah.
So this is a really interesting question. I'm sitting here thinking, as a former print journalist a long time ago, we didn't have social media when I started out, and we weren't supposed to express our opinions in it. And if we covered a news event, we needed to be objective. So
Exactly.
it's a really interesting thing. If I were hiring, I just think we should think about this for a minute. If I were an editor hiring a journalist now, do I have the responsibility, if I'm hiring that person to cover a very specific regional area, to see if that person perhaps is biased as opposed to being objective?
I think so, for multiple reasons. First of all, these people were covering the Jewish state, and their hatred of Jews was all over their Facebook. So I think that's the first point, like you said, that's important to make. It was not like they were covering Cyprus. And at the same time, all these media outlets have ethical guidelines, and they have a lot of guidebooks and rules about political expression for journalists, and what is and what isn't allowed. And these rules are very strict in general. Especially, for example, the BBC has an entire website built where they delineate whatever their journalists are allowed to say and what they cannot say publicly. But
and
whether these
wait, let me just clarify. Those rules say what they can say publicly on their own social media accounts.
Yes.
Okay.
But the problem at the same time is that these guidelines are clearly not being followed. We recently wrote an article about BBC Arabic, where one of my coworkers exposed the fact that several contributors to BBC Arabic shared posts on Twitter saying "Death to Israel," which is a clear violation of the BBC's ethical guidelines. We reached out to the BBC, and they said they take our concerns seriously. But up until now, they have not been fired. So yeah, it's that it makes it all the more important that Honest Reporting and other organizations too call them out publicly, and as to build up pressure for these outlets to really enforce their own guidelines.
And Akiva, after you call out media, what are usually the consequences? So, as you indicated, several contributors have been fired after you expose them as anti-Semites. Are there also consequences for the newspaper or the media outlet?
Well, obviously they are embarrassed by this. I think that is clear. And a lot of times we have a lot of contacts with foreign journalists in Israel, and also with their bosses, usually in the U.S. We sit down with them, and we have lunch with them, and tell them our concerns, and they take that very seriously. I think there was a journalist for one of the major U.S. newspapers, who told us that what you write on your website, you are totally justified, and the criticism is justified of our work, and that is really important, not to just bash them, but to actually give them the facts so they can do their work better too, which is what most of the journalists who are reasonable want. They do not want to make mistakes. I remember just this week there was an article in the Dutch press about foreign journalists, Dutch correspondents in Israel, and one of them said, I am actually very afraid of making mistakes. And this is a reasonable person who is open to criticism, and we help them by calling out mistakes.
I will just say we use the word critique, not criticism. Open to, as a journalist, you're not criticizing them, you're critiquing what they're saying.
That is exactly what we do. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Just because people get really upset about the word criticism. So I have a very important question, which is, what advice do you have for our listeners? How to respond in like daily life when people say inaccurate things about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
That's a very deep question, with a lot of possible answers. I think one of the answers should be get informed. Just know the facts. It is very easy to call someone out for hating Israel or being anti-Semitic, but it is not as easy to prove them wrong and know all the facts to convince at least other people that they are wrong, or maybe even convince them that they are wrong. So I think that is my most important advice, to know the facts. An example of this is I wrote an article yesterday about the whole conundrum surrounding Ben and Jerry's, the ice cream boycott, which would have meant that I as a Jew living in Samaria would not be able to get Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I think my wife would have been very upset. But they reversed it. At least they're trying to. There's a whole court case going on. And virtually all the major media outlets, they without any criticism, they echoed statements by Ben and Jerry's founders that they made on MSNBC, saying that the Unilever's decision to keep selling Ben and Jerry's in what they call the occupied Palestinian territories violates the merger agreement between Unilever and Ben and Jerry's, the statement they made. So I wrote an article yesterday, and I actually pulled up this merger agreement from 2000. And it turns out that there's actually a clause in there saying that the company Ben and Jerry's is signing on that they will help Unilever get a license to sell their products in Israel. So there's a contractual obligation to the Ben and Jerry's company here to actually sell ice cream in Israel. And that is an example of something that was completely lost in the whole discussion around this issue. Again, it just takes going into these original documents that you can find online and know the facts. And I think that is my most important advice to anyone. Don't just scream.
Where would you advise people to get the facts?
Well, a starting point would be honestreporting.com, I think.
Okay.
No, there's a lot of amazing organizations out there doing really important work. We try to add our piece of that. And also I think it's important that everyone who is fighting the same fight work together. That's why we appreciate it so much when people send us whatever they're reading in their local media or national media even. If there's a certain bias against Israel and they reach out to us, that's extremely valuable. So yeah, I would advise people to follow organizations like Honest Reporting and stay informed.
Does your organization need donations? In other words, is that what keeps your reporting ongoing?
Yes, our entire organization runs on donations. We are very thankful for our sponsors.
Okay, that's what I just wanted to say. One way to get the information that you can use is for our listeners to consider donating. This is not a plug. We don't raise money on the show, but I'm just saying, and then they have access. I mean, everyone has access to your information, but we would be helping
and also,
you to get information.
Also, when people want to stay informed, they can sign up for our newsletter, which will get you a almost daily newsletter with the most important news from Israel that we compose every day of the work week. And also you will receive our articles, which are media critiques, educational pieces about Israel, and also videos that we produce. So I can encourage everyone to sign up to our newsletter on honestreporting.com.
And as we come to the end of this interview, do you have any last words that you feel we definitely should talk about here?
I think we covered a whole lot. You took the words out of my mouth. I think it's important to work that everyone on the same team work together. And I hope if anyone has any information or spots media bias in the media, I hope they reach out to me, and together we'll ensure truth in the media.
Thank you so much, so very much for being on our show. We thank our listeners. For anyone who has not yet watched the documentary Never Again Is Now, which features
it's really
Evelyn.
Great. I saw it.
Yeah,
thank you.
And it's a lot about the Netherlands, but also then has an epilogue about the United States. Very important. You can see it on Amazon or YouTube. To get more information about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, you can go to thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we close every show, we say, without putting yourself in physical harm, please speak up whenever you can against anti-Semitism and all hate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything that you do.
Great, Akiva. Thank you so much. It was a fantastic interview. Very,